Hi everyone and welcome to our Flipped Collaborate for both the units EDU30063, which is a main unit of teaching literacy, as well as those who are in EDU3067, which is now our new teaching English specialization unit. So we've actually had the unit broken up into two just to save, I suppose, confusion, and just to make sure that the advice and everything is tailored to both of those separate groups. What's important to remember is that the content is the same in both units. It's just the marking rubric which is different, as well as the word counts, because you are given a much more detailed word count in the specialization so that you're able to meet the rubric criteria. Now, in the specialization unit, it is me all on my lonesome, and in the teaching English main unit, it's just Alka and I. So there is going to be a little bit of crossover between the units in terms of flip collaborates and collaborates, because it's just very hard when you're on your own with no one else, I suppose, to help. So my purpose with this flip collaborate is just to focus on content so that it can get out to both groups. From there, we will have our interactive collab, and my plan is to have it all together for the content, but then to have an extra half an hour session afterwards with only specialization students just to talk about specialization and what those people need to include in their assessment. I'll make that all much clearer in the Padlet and in announcements and things over the next few weeks. I know it's a while away, having a week 8 due date, so let's just focus on content for now and what you can do to get started. Now, I do apologise, I do try and keep these flip collaborates to 30 minutes, but this is quite a detailed assessment, and since there's only 2 assessments for this unit, this report and the folio of lessons, the unit planner, they are quite detailed. This is Rachel's top 5 things you need to know. If you've had me as a UC before, you'll know that I like to give you some things just to get started. Considering this is week 1, and like we said, there's a week 8 due date, what can you do now? What do you need to do now? What can you relate to our learning materials? What can you relate to our readings that's going to help you to get started? So let's get cracking. So if you've had a look at the assessment details, you'll notice that it talks you through things that need to go in the findings section. So I'm not going to talk too much today about the executive summary and the introduction, because we'll talk about what you need to include in that in our interactive collab. And introductions can be pretty straightforward because they're just a synopsis of the main ideas or the main contentions of the rest of the essay. What's really important for you to think about now in these early stages of our unit is, as you're progressing through these first couple of weeks, you're bearing these things in mind. You're thinking to yourself, oh, we're learning about what is literacy this week. That's something that I'm going to need to connect to for my assessment. When we're talking about different forms of assessment and assessment choices in all of the different areas of reading, writing, speaking, listening, you'll know that you're going to, oh yeah, I need to write about assessment for my own assessment. So these are things that you'll need to know now and to bear in mind for the rest of the unit or for the next few weeks. So in the findings section, it mentions, let me get the exact wording, that you are going to identify definitions of the concept of literacy. So this is the first thing that you need to do after your introduction, is to define literacy. What does it mean to be literate? Now, we all know that being literate means obviously being able to read and write, and that is something that you're going to have to connect to in your essay. But my advice here is to think also about the broader implications of literacy. So what does it mean to be literate these days? What skills do you need to be able to be able to be a productive member of society? In our assessment details and in the rubric, it asks you to connect to curriculum and curriculum frameworks. It doesn't mean that you need to connect to specific learning outcomes, but you can use the curriculum to base your concept of literacy off. So what I have done from the Australian curriculum, and in a moment I'll switch slides and just connect to the internet and show you where I got this information from. You can find so much in the aims, in the rationale about what is literacy. It defines it for us. It talks about the fact that literacy is fundamental to students' ability to learn at school, but also to engage in a productive society. That's what we are educating students for. So you need to connect to the fact of these broader implications, the fact that students need to be able to connect to the skills so that they're able to communicate, so that they're able to function in a modern day society. You're connecting to 21st century outcomes, the fact that we need to be able to text. You don't need to be specific in the things that you mention, but you need to say the world is multimodal. We need to be able to access different things, thinking about the fact that the workforce and jobs in general are so much more complex, even in say positions where you wouldn't imagine there being a great deal of literacy skill. You still need to be able to talk to people. You still need to be able to form an email or a text message, or fill in invoices or something like that, which needs you to be literate. So there's a much higher demand on the needing to be literate, just to even, not so much even just jobs, but just to function in your everyday life. Think about paying a bill. Think about going to the supermarket. All these day-to-day jobs require you to be literate. So what does that mean for our assessment? It means we're going to talk about literacy and the fact that we're educating students to be literate in this. Think about socio-cultural aspects. All of this connects to the readings in week 1. So week 1 now, think about this as you're reading this week. Think about the implications of what it means to be literate. Define it very specifically. So your ELA will come along and mark against that section and say, you have defined literacy in a 21st century multimodal world. So that's little part of the first part of the rubric. It also says here, 1 minute, I'm just going to show you, just going to move that for a second. I want to show you this. If you go to the Australian curriculum and just click on curriculum and then click on English, you will find that it says here how English works. Click on that one. And you've got the rationale, which is full of great stuff when you're introducing and defining what literacy is. Definitely have a read through that. That's probably where I took that little snippet from. There is also the aims, which defines what it means to be literate as well. And then I'm not going to show you them all because you can have a look at yourself. The structure, this is where the scope and sequence is that I have posted on some of my discussion boards, which we will definitely need a lot more for A2. Not so much for this one because we're looking at literacy curriculum in a much broader sense, not so much specific outcomes. I know that's what people are going to ask me when it says curriculum. Do I need to put content descriptors? No, we're just connecting to the philosophy that's inside this curriculum. What does it mean to be literate? What are we trying to teach kids? So definitely scope out the curriculum and see what's in there. Now, my next thing that I felt like I let people down last time. I feel like I didn't really discuss this concept of impact very well. So this is why I'm redoing this flip COLLAB as opposed to using the one we used last teaching period. What does it mean to discuss impact? Now, if you have a look at the findings section, it says use your chosen curriculum document, again, so AC or your own state curriculum, and supporting literature. You must use supporting literature. There's not enough in the unit to come to your own conclusions about this. You're going to have to look further and read further to discuss the impact that literacy teaching has on children's learning and development in primary schools. It's point 2 in your finding section in the assessment details. So I had to go off researching. There's not enough within the unit to answer that question per se. That's why they're asking you to do further research. When I did further research, it kept bringing me back to Hattie. So that's my recommendation. These are just my ideas. Please read further, do more. This is not the be end and end all of everything, but just an idea. When you have a look at Hattie's, when he talks about effect size, what you are analysing is what's the impact that this literacy teacher is going to have on students' learning. Now, Hattie's work tells us that the teacher is the most important part of this puzzle. Have a look at this pie chart here. Now, the students are the students. We can't change who they are biologically or physically. They are who they are. So the students are them. What can be changed is the things on the other side of the pie graph. So, principal and schools and peers and home only have a small part. What we can focus on is the quality of teaching. Look how much of a big impact that has on student learning and student success. Now, in the beginning of the essay, you're telling me that literacy is this all-important thing that people need to be able to succeed in their lives, to be able to function as a successful adult in this world. Well, we need to provide quality teaching to ensure that kids are meeting literacy outcomes. Let's have a look at this table over here. Feedback to students had the #1 effect size on influencing student outcomes. And this is not just in literacy. It's in all instruction, but you can tailor it to a literacy sort of focus when you talk about it, or perhaps you can do some further research to see if there is anything connected to literacy per se. But we know that quality instruction, direct instruction, and feedback are all things that you would do within your own literacy pedagogy anyway. So these are the things, this is the evidence that proves to us that quality teaching impacts kids. And if you want to mention in your essay that what happens when kids don't get this quality teaching, how does that impact on them in their learning and their life later on? We will talk more about impact in the interactive collab, but that is definitely something to think about. And it is something that you might want to put a little bit of research into now. How does the quality of teaching impact kids' ability to learn to read and write and speak and listen? Your next thing you're going to do is choose 2 literacy assessments. The literacy assessment choice is completely up to you. It doesn't matter what year level they're from. It doesn't matter if one's reading and one's writing. Although a little bit of a word of advice, speaking and listening assessments are quite tricky to analyse. So last teaching period, I asked people just to steer clear of that, but it's not a rule, it's just a bit of advice. If it was me personally writing this report, I would find it hard to really get the depth of discussion that you need out of a speaking and listening assessment. But that's just my opinion. So if you're happy to choose a speaking and listening assessment and you'd really like to do it and you can find enough evidence and enough analysis within that, then go for it. But for me, the reading and writing ones, probably a lot more information out there. They're a lot easier to access. You might have seen them used before, whereas speaking and listening is often just assessed a bit more incidentally and a bit more sort of observed rather than a really strong assessment. You can choose formative and summative assessments. I'll have to double check in the rubric if there was any specification about that, but as far as I can see from the learning details, it was just your chosen assessment. So if you want to choose one more formative and one summative, there is no need to compare across assessments. They are critiqued and analysed individually. You're not comparing one against the other. You're just having a look at them as an individual entity. So you won't need to worry if you've got one reading and one writing. There's no need to compare. Now I'm going to flick to the next slide, but then I'm going to flick back again because I'm going to walk you through the first of the dot points around assessment says to discuss the key benefits and implications / limitations of your chosen assessments. Now, I have decided to have a look at comprehension, So if you haven't seen PAT-R before, it is a comprehension test. There are hard copies, but you can also do it online. This is a little example that I got from ASA that shows you a passage of reading, and then so it's got Mrs. Black's house. Why did Mrs. Black want to sell her house? There was no garden, it was cold and dark, there were no cupboards, she was tired of living in it. So through the small part of reading, then they'd have some multiple choice questions, and then especially the computerized version I find is a bit more straightforward because it produces certain documents for you that you can analyze as a teacher. But this is a little bit of a snapshot of what it looks like. Let me jump back one slide and have a look at this. Now, benefits of doing a PAT-R. One thing that I would like to say firstly is that your benefits and limitations section are going to be your most explicit. They're going to be benefits and limitations regarding the teaching, regarding the assessment's ability to provide you with information. So you imagine yourself in the classroom and you have some grade 4 students that you need to test their comprehension. Is PAT-R worth doing? What information does it give you? How is it going to be able to drive my teaching? How is it going to inform me so that I can plan and differentiate for my next lot of lessons? Is it giving me enough information? Is it just giving me information that certain kids can comprehend certain comprehension styles? Does it tell me that they can infer? Does it tell me that they understand different vocab? Does it tell me that they can reorganize? What information is the assessment giving you? Now, your benefits and limitations need to be really, really explicit. And I'll get down to these little red things in a minute and tell you what is not explicit. So let's have a look at PAT-R first. So what's good about it? It directly assesses the different aspects of comprehension. So it looks at things like retrieving directly stated information. So that connects to your ability to look at literal comprehension, which is part of the curriculum at all of those grade levels from grade probably 2 up. You're reflecting on text, you're interpreting explicit information and interpreting by making inferences. So it does look at inferencing separately, which I like, because within the Australian curriculum and the Victorian curriculum, it looks at making literal and inferred meaning from comprehension specifically. So that would help you with your reporting. As you saw with my little example, it's a short amount of text, which is something that I thought was a benefit of this particular assessment. It was a short amount of text. So even kids that maybe have still a little bit of trouble with decoding, it's not a long amount of text that's going to be totally disengaging. So short amount of text and reading for easy interpretation. So short paragraph test, not pages and pages of text that the kids have got to get through. Our scores are connected to year levels. So it tells you that this certain student is working at grade 4 level, working at grade 2 level. Your spreadsheets can be analysed, which when you go off and do your analysis of your assessment, you will find out more about. There's an element of looking at vocab, which I thought was really, really important, because vocab development is so important to being able to comprehend. And when you're asked to connect to further research, that could be something that you could look into further, how vocabulary enhancement works to improve your level of comprehension. Informs teachers of areas of reading comprehension to inform their planning, and results are tracked over grade levels, which I just said. So these are my benefits. These are all things that help me as a teacher to move kids forward. If I know that these 3 students got the inferential question right in Pat R, but these two students didn't, well, that's a point of need. That's a point of teaching that I am then able to say, okay, student A and student B need to come and work with me a little bit more on inference, because I can see in their Pat R questions that it was quite a theme of them getting those sorts of questions wrong. There's not just one inferential question, there will be multiple of them. So students get quite a number of chances to show that they have a particular skill. So then I'm able to draw them out and work with them. So it makes for easier differentiation and flexible grouping that I'm able to really target kids at need. Now, just as your benefits are completely explicit to your assessment, your limitations will be as well. I didn't really like the fact that it's multiple choice. I really like short answer better, which is why I tend to always favour probe more, because that's a comprehension test that asks you what's the answer and why do you think that, so that you're able to get an interpretation of what the student is thinking. This is not one-on-one. It's on a computer, so kids can just click anything. I've seen it done. There's some kids that just want to get through it and they'll just click on, a bit like NAPLAN, click a question, choose a box, move on to the next one. You're going to need some teacher assistance to interpret the data. So some of the data presented in the spreadsheets can be quite overwhelming. Perhaps on your level of experience, you might not be able to interpret the data as needed. And there are some strategies to do with comprehension that aren't covered. So just having inference and literal comprehension covered, a little bit of vocab was covered, but there are other things. They didn't assess their ability to predict. It didn't assess their ability to use visualization, or even it didn't even really assess their ability to evaluate, which is quite an important comprehension strategy. So all of my examples are very explicit examples related to Pat R. Things that I liked about them, Pat R, and things that I think could be a potential limitation in the quality of the data. That's what you need to keep reminding yourself. What is the quality of the data like? You're sitting at your desk, you're in your classroom, you've done a whole lot of your assessment on the grade. Has it given you enough data to be able to plan your next series of lessons? And a lot of assessments won't. They don't give you enough. They don't tell you which kids need to know more about certain skills. Now, with this section of your findings, you need to be really explicit. So don't give us benefits that are too broad. Don't give us benefits which are too external to this particular assessment. So what I mean, things like easy to administer is not a good benefit, because there could be an assessment that's quite hard to administer, and there might be an assessment that's quite timely, but it's worth it because it gives you excellent quality of data. The amount of time it takes shouldn't be a benefit or limitation. It can come under factors. So we'll talk about factors in the next little section. It could be a factor that teachers need to consider, but it's not a benefit or a limitation of the quality of the data you're getting from your assessment. A limitation, sometimes people put things like, it takes a long time to photocopy it, or what will happen if the internet cuts out. These are not good quality limitations, because, if the internet cuts out, that's not the assessment's fault. That's not a flaw in the data that the assessment is producing. So try to focus really strongly on the quality of the data, not external things like, some kids might interrupt me when I'm doing my assessment. Well, kids can interrupt in any assessment, let's face it. And yes, a lot of assessments are time consuming. A lot of assessments have a lot of photocopying, or there might only be one book where you'd prefer to have 5 books. But try and focus on the quality of the data it produces. And again, I'll talk more about this in the interactive collab. So as much as your benefits and limitations are going to be extraordinarily specific to your particular your particular assessment. And at the interactive collab, we will give you more examples of assessments you can choose, more examples of the benefits and limitations. Now, factors is where you can be a little bit more broad and a little bit more open to just identifying the factors that could be at play. So it could be things like, it could potentially be time consuming and things like that can enter into the factors section. So, identify factors that contribute to the use of the assessment. So, does it have complex language that's being used? And again, this is not an exhaustive list, this is just my ideas. So, does it have complex language that potentially kids won't understand? Is that a factor that could contribute to the use of the assessment? Maybe it would skew results. There could be it probably connects very well to my third point. I might actually talk about those two together. Sometimes assessment have language used that do have some sort of cultural bias to them. So there are assessments where they might be talking about a game of cricket, where you have things like bat or googly or bowling, and there might be things that are specific to that particular event or particular science task or you might go down to the beach and there might be language used that could be complex for some students. They may be able to comprehend, but is there some language used that could be confusing? Is there a cultural bias within the assessment, particularly reading assessment? Not so much writing assessment, but there could be a cultural bias to the stories. Think about, Fontes and Pinnell or PM Benchmark or any other sort of reading test. Can we assume that all kids know about all of the things the test is assuming that they know? Do we have access to all materials? So this is where you could talk about, there are some rural parts of this country which may find online assessments difficult if that relates to the assessment that you have chosen. Comprehension of experiences, or perhaps the structure and format might be factors as well. So your factors are quite broad, and at our interactive collab we will talk about some specific assessments that we have used in our classroom and some factors that we think might contribute to the use. So they're just things that teachers would consider when implementing the particular assessment. Now, the potential effects on children's learning. If we have a look at the assessment details, it says to report on the potential effects of the assessment in relation to children's learning and development in English curriculum in a primary context. So there could be things like, what are the potential effects on children's learning? So if we implement this particular assessment, is it going to have a positive influence on children's learning, or perhaps it could have even a negative influence? Now, we have to remember that we are critiquing these assessments. We are critiquing them. So if you could critique your assessment and you find that there's actually quite a few limitations and that the assessment itself is not very good, you might have that some of the potential effects are that it doesn't help to set learning goals. It doesn't actually help for any clarification for the teacher in order to do flexible grouping or work collaboratively or differentiate their program. It doesn't give clarity around other curriculum areas. So perhaps there's some negative, depending on what you find out about your assessment. If your assessment is absolutely amazing, it's going to have wonderful effects on the students and the teachers in terms of gathering that data. So it should have a positive effect on students' learning. Some of those rubrics and things, particularly with writing, not all rubrics are great. Some of them don't even connect to curriculum outcomes. Some of the boxes between rubric areas don't really give the teacher a very good understanding of what's required at each level. So there's going to be perhaps even some negative effects on children's learning depending on what the assessment is. we will give you some examples of that at our interactive collab. Now, in our findings, not in the conclusion, this is different from maths. So if you're doing the maths unit at the same time, and I know the assessments are extremely similar, but this is different. Our findings go in, our recommendations go in the findings section. So making recommendations is not in the conclusion. The conclusion is a separate entity. In our findings section, we need to make recommendations. We need to make recommendations that include inclusive policies and specific teaching strategies. So this has been listed for us. So what things we did notice last time when we were marking this particular section is that sometimes people's recommendations were quite broad and they weren't really very literacy focused. So always keep your literacy hat on and just remember to always connect back to literacy, or try to have that literacy flavor to it. Now, some things are just going to be good practice. Like obviously we want assessment data should inform our teaching. That's obviously something that's going to happen in maths and all areas of the curriculum. But we want to have that literacy flavor to it. I suppose in the examples that we give, that's where we're going to show that we understand this with a literacy flavor to it. So I might say that I want literacy assessment should be inclusive of all our needs. And in your example that you could connect to that, you could say that, you know, literacy assessment shouldn't have bias in the reading materials, and we should make sure that it is inclusive of all nationalities and religious groups. So reading material should be very carefully chosen. See, I've made that's quite a broad statement. Literacy assessment should be inclusive of all our needs, but I've given an example that has shown that I understand it within a literacy context. Literacy assessment should be very timely and provide student feedback. I would connect to some sort of evidence that shows that literacy outcomes improve for students when I'm able to give them timely feedback, and that connects to Hattie as well. Same with differentiation. Now, your recommendations are not just a list. If you don't give examples or sort of flesh them out a bit, they might be classroom-based examples or academic evidence-based examples, but you have to connect to the classroom. That's how you're connecting to specific teaching strategies, or it has to connect to, well, inclusion. So it could be things like the curriculum, AITSL. We'll think of more policies around that. Each Department of Education website will have inclusion policies that need to be followed. So as well as that, we're having real life connections to teaching practice. Now you're going to talk about literacy pedagogy perhaps, so things like modelled writing, shared reading. But it also can just be, when it says specific teaching strategies, it might also be things like HITS, so high impact teaching strategies, which we're going to use a lot in our assessment 2 as well. So all it's asking for are recommendations that make literacy assessment accessible to everyone and just really strong in terms of providing that data to teachers, which ultimately improves student learning outcomes for everyone. At the interactive collab, I will give you examples from old assessments of what recommendations are, how you write them, and how you flesh them out a little bit, so that dot points are fine, but you can't just have a short sentence. They need to be sort of worked through and fleshed out a bit, because it's quite a main part of the rubric. Next one is referencing and formatting. I'm not going to talk through word counts because this is a shared flipped collab. We'll talk about that more in the interactive collab. You can look them up yourself in the assessment details. One recommendation that I do want to make to you now as my 5th thing that you're going to think about early on in the TP is you've got your executive summary, which is a very, very short, sharp, succinct little sentence about what this assessment is all about. You'll have a well-worked introduction, which highlights the main ideas about the fact that this assessment talks about the concept of literacy and the impact good teaching has on literacy. It talks about 2 assessments and it critiques them, and it makes some recommendations about quality literacy teaching in, literacy assessment into the future, and it connects to some recommendations. Within this section here, the findings, you're going to talk about your 2 assessments. So it makes sense to me that you would you'd talk about the concept of literacy, you'd talk about the impact teachers have, and then you'd talk about assessment 1, whatever that is for you. So your first assessment, you're going to talk about it. You're going to talk about the benefits, limitations, effects, and factors. And then you're going to talk about your second assessment. So I would go through all of the assessment in detail the whole way through, and then I would start my second assessment. That's just an idea, and I think it worked well for a lot of students last time. Those doing specialisation need at least 10 references. Those doing the main unit need 7 at least, but obviously you can use more. The more academic research, the better. Use strong use of APA and strong personal literacy. So always remember to proofread your assessment, because it's always a source of extra marks for you. That's the end of our presentation. As I said, in our interactive collab, we will be going through the content first. For both units, main unit and specialisation, everybody is welcome to attend just to talk about the content and have a look at our assessment examples. Main unit students will then finish up, and specialisation students are welcome to continue on for the next half an hour just to talk about their rubric and what needs to be covered in a bit more detail for specialisation students. So more clarity will come through that presentation. See you then, and good luck with starting.